Hey guys, um, I'm making this video because I've been working on something for, man, how long? Let me check my calendar. I feel like I've been in a wormhole on this project. It turned into a project. It wasn't supposed to be a project. I feel like I've been working on this for more than a week, but at least a week. So, I wanted to do weeks ago, I had this idea of doing a 9/11 anniversary episode. And what prompted me to want to do this was the video of Omar al-Bayoumi, the alleged Saudi intelligence officer who had ties to the 9/11 hijackers. There was a video that came out of him, sort of casing isn't quite the right word. He was almost creating this this video of the Capitol grounds and the larger National Mall, which includes the Washington Monument, to kind of in a way to sort of acclimate his audience to what this area looked like, and kind of give them a lay of the land. This video came out in June of this year, and that's what had prompted me to reach out to Bob Kerrey, Senator Bob Kerrey, who had been on the podcast in 2018, where we talked briefly about 9/11, because he was one of the 10 9/11 commissioners, no, one of the 10 members of the 9/11 Commission, 10 or 11, how many there were. Um, and so I wanted to talk to him about what happened on 9/11, because a lot of information has come out over the years, and he had said on my podcast something that uh, Bob, why I'm blanking on the name of the senator, Bob, who was it that, anyway, a different senator had made, which was that there was there was a conspiracy of Saudi nationals involved in 9/11. And I think exactly what Bob Kerrey said was that they had blood on their hands, the members of the Saudi royal family or the Saudi government. Um, and so I was like, all right, let me bring Bob back on, and I want to talk about 9/11. So I had scheduled this already, and I was supposed to speak with Bob on Tuesday. I'm recording this on Friday, April 23rd. I'm going to end up speaking with him tomorrow. And as I started doing all this research into 9/11 again, just to kind of get reacclimated and update what I knew, because a few more things had come out, uh, primarily because of plaintiff family, 9/11 family cases that were working their way through the courts. And there was one in the Southern District of New York, which is the reason why this video was unsealed. Because this video was discovered days after 9/11 in a raid of al-Bayoumi's apartment in London, where they also discovered a video of him with the 9/11 hijackers at a party that was going on at their apartment, which, by the way, I think, co-signed the lease on their apartment. He had also helped fund them and set up a bank account. So there was this video, and there was also a drawing of a plane with some calculations about approximating the distance from the ground based on where the plane was. So I started kind of, as I started to read into some of the latest stuff that had come out, I started putting the, making the effort to understand this conspiracy better. Because, when I had Bob Kerrey on, and I had read about, this was when, this is a few years after the 28 pages, the redacted 28 pages from the Joint Congressional Inquiry that was concluded in late 2002, December 2002, led by the Senate. And who was it at the Senate? Again, I'm forgetting the guy's name, blanking on the Bob Graham. There you go, Bob Graham, Senator Bob Graham. And then I don't remember who was in Congress at the time. It might have been Porter Goss, actually, who then became CIA director. But those 28 pages were redacted from that report, and they showed that there was reason to suspect the Saudi involvement. So anyway, those pages had come out in 2016, and I had read them before my conversation with Bob Kerrey, but I'd never gone the extra step to really understand how to make sense of that, because my initial impression was when I read this, it was what do the Saudis have to do with 9/11? Doesn't make any sense. I get that they had Wahhabism and extremists, and maybe there were some rogue people in the Saudi. I didn't really understand the connection, and I didn't understand why Bob Kerrey was saying that it was a conspiracy that went to the highest levels of the Saudi government. And at the time, I don't remember really getting clued into any of the role of the CIA or the intelligence community in all of this. And so when I went down this road again, I started to, basically I made a decision that I just wanted to figure this out or figure out what was, just keep going. And I read the plaintiffs, the whole court document stuff. I read Doug Canistratos. It's in the IR for this episode that I'm doing. I think I forget his name exactly. I'll tell you right now, actually. Doug, oops, Doug Canistrato. Yeah, so sorry, Don Canistratos affidavit. There's this. He was a military commission investigator. And I just started reading a lot more than that, right? And then I eventually read this book. I found these guys. These guys have written this book. It was published in 2017, I think. The Watchdogs Didn't Bark. The CIA, NSA, and the Crimes of the War on Terror. First of all, I heard these guys in an interview when I was going down the rabbit hole. And I was like, these guys are really credible people. And they were, and it turned out they had interviewed Richard Clarke. So like, pause. I should hit pause here and say, because I've said this once before when I did one of these videos when I had Jeffrey Sachs on, and and I said, like, I cut my teeth on this stuff. I grew up with this stuff. I was a college student when 9/11 happened, and I got steeped in all of the progressive anti-war intellectual communities. And of course, this was when guys like Richard Clarke in 2004 published Against All Enemies, which I read. Richard Clarke was the sort of his exact title for, let's see here, what was his exact title? He was the kind of the liaison between the White House and the CIA, or the sort of counter-terror people at CIA. Would he even be anyway? I need to get offhand, but I was very familiar with Richard Clarke. I'd seen his testimony before the 9/11 Commission, where he had apologized to 9/11 families and asked for their forgiveness. He, of course, I also remember he went, the Bush administration went after him hardcore. But I also read Michael Scheuer's Imperial Hubris. I've met Michael Scheuer. I interviewed him for Capital Account. Michael Scheuer was the guy that created Alex Station, which was the Osama bin Laden station at CIA. And it's named Alex Station because it's named after Michael Scheuer's son. So I have this like deep background in all this stuff. I studied it. I watched it. I watched CNN. I watched it in real time. I lived it. I mean, I know this as well as I know anything. So I started going down this rabbit hole, and I saw an interview of Richard Clarke that these guys did with him. They interviewed him in 2000 and I think the interview was 2009. And apparently, like, this interview created a shitstorm, and Richard Clarke didn't do any more interviews on this subject for 7 years, I believe. 7 or 8, yeah, 7 years. He did another interview in 2016. He wrote an op-ed for ABC after the 28 pages came out, where he doubled down on what he had talked about in this interview he did with these guys. And all this stuff is in the IR, and I can also link to it in the member community. But it's a fascinating interview. And what Clarke basically puts forward, and this is what I'm going to talk about both with Bob Kerrey and with these guys, because these guys are also coming on. He lays out a theory basically, because I could go into all detail here, and I will try to in these conversations, but there were multiple instances where the CIA didn't just, because the narrative after 9/11 that we got was that there was this international terrorist organization, Al Qaeda, that was operating largely alone. There were intimations that there were overt accusations of support by the Taliban, right, in Afghanistan. So there was state support with Afghanistan, and there were intimations that there were some connections with Saddam Hussein. Those were never made in a compelling way. There were obviously no intimations. In fact, I think Saddam had issued a fatwa, Osama bin Laden for sure had issued a fatwa against Saddam Hussein. But the narrative was they were acting largely alone, and that they evaded through both competence and also through the incompetence. Not incompetence. That's incorrect. So they evaded the FBI and CIA, but what was largely to blame was that these organizations were siloed, that they weren't cooperating and communicating with each other, which was the justification for the Office of Director of National Intelligence, DNI. And I think yeah, so I'm trying to remember the name of the guy. One of the Greek brothers, his brothers at MIT, and um, Negroponte, I think, was the first director of national intelligence. So the idea was to create this office in order to bridge the divide between NSA, CIA, FBI. And when you trace all the details, and this is all public record stuff that I'm relying on here, you see that there were multiple instances where, yes, there was a it wasn't so much that there was miscommunication, there was a willful obstruction, both on the part of the NSA. The NSA didn't catch a lot of flack for what they did. They were involved in some of this stuff. And without, I could, again, off memory, I can talk about some of this, but I don't necessarily want to confuse anyone. But CIA willfully obstructed in key instances the dissemination of information to the FBI that would have led to the arrest of hijackers and in all likelihood, the disruption of the plot. And there were multiple instances where this was happening. And the most sort of damning instance of this was in the summer of 2001, where, if you guys will recall, this was the summer where George Tenet was saying he was running around with his hair on fire, quote, hair on fire. And when he demanded an urgent emergency meeting, which he described as the most urgent meeting that he had ever done in the 7 years that he'd been CIA director, that he had ever called for. In the it was either the August 6th meeting, or it was a meeting in July, on July 10th. But these were key instances, both July 10th and August 6th. These were principals meetings. This is where Condoleezza Rice was at the meeting. This is where Richard Clarke was at the meeting. And there was another meeting on, I think, September 4th. Again, at no point did George Tenet bring up the fact that they knew that there were these hijackers. They didn't know them as hijackers. They knew, this now goes into a larger story, but there was clear reason for them to know that these guys were bad news, because they were at the Malaysia meeting where the bombers of the USS Cole were also involved, and there was further evidence that implicated them. So Richard Clarke, in his interview with these guys, the authors of this book, puts out a theory, and he basically says that it's just, looking at the facts when trying to make sense of them, he finds it inconceivable that George Tenet would not have known. So the director of the CIA would not have known that people like Rich Blee, who was then head of Alex Station, he took over for for Michael Scheuer, or Cofer Black, who was head of counterterrorism. He found it implausible that George Tenet wouldn't have known about these hijackers, about I forget, I messed up these Arabic names. Not, one of them was Mindar, and the other guy was Nafwal. Messed these names up. Sorry guys, give me a second here. Obviously I can't do these during an interview, so probably should get right. Nawaf Al-Hazmi and Khalid Al-Mindar. These are the two guys that were at the Malaysia summit meeting in 2000, where the guys who planned the Cole bombing, the USS Cole, were also, and then they got multiple entry visas and came to Los Angeles, were met by al-Bayoumi, the Saudi intelligence officer, by the way, who was getting paid along with another guy, Basan, by not only the Saudi government, but checks getting cut directly by Prince Bandar. So, like, some of you guys will remember Prince Bandar Bush. He was the son of the soon-to-be Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He was so close to the Bush family. So anyway, weird stuff. But so anyway, Clarke was like, it's inconceivable that Tenet wouldn't have known. And he goes, I cannot understand. He goes, the only thing that makes sense to me, he's like, he made the point that him and George Tenet had known each other forever, and they talked all the time. And Tenet shared all sorts of stuff with him, the most sort of insignificant stuff. And Tenet was also known to, like, just be a hands-on guy. It wasn't something where he delegated a bunch of stuff. He would get his hands dirty all the time and get raw intelligence. So again, he expected him to know, and his only explanation for why Tenet didn't tell him was that he believed, this is Richard Clarke's theory, and it makes so much sense, and it's crazy when you kind of put these pieces together. He put forward the theory that the CIA when Cofer Black, especially when Cofer Black came at the head of counterterrorism, was committed to infiltrating Al Qaeda because they didn't have anyone inside the organization. And so they were working on recruiting people, and they had this one guy in particular that they had been trying to recruit, who eventually they weren't able to. And he was involved in the summit in Malaysia somehow. Can't remember exactly how. And in the process of kind of trying to flip him and realizing they couldn't flip him, they caught on to Al Mindar and Hazmi. And so decided that they weren't trying to flip those guys. And so when they figured out that those guys were flying to the United States, they purposefully intercepted the cable from the FBI so the FBI wouldn't know. They actually went out of their way to prevent the FBI from knowing, and that wasn't the first occasion. They doubled down on that in future instances to prevent the FBI from knowing that these individuals who would have been like high priority targets were entering the United States. And the theory further is that they then worked with Saudi intelligence and guys like al-Bayoumi through Prince Bandar's, who was, again, Prince Bandar was U.S. Saudi ambassador to the United States, through his office, and who else was involved, who knows, and tried to infiltrate this San Diego cell in cooperation with Saudi intelligence through these guys like al-Bayoumi. And that perhaps what happened was they got played. They got played by al-Bayoumi. Again, like this is where the kind of the story becomes more difficult to follow because there's not enough information to know exactly who is responsible here. Who got played? Who was a double agent? Who wasn't? But the thing that's really especially incriminating in all of this, it isn't that the CIA, didn't share cable with the FBI on purpose because they wanted to infiltrate the cell rather than have the FBI turn into a criminal investigation, et cetera, et cetera. What's really unforgivable is that, again, if you prescribe to this theory, and it's a good theory, and there's a lot of evidence to support it, and Clark is a very credible guy, who really, in this instance, I can't conceive of a reason that he would have to lie. What's unforgivable is that it appears that the CIA, at some point in the summer of 2001, went from feeling like they had control of the situation to feeling like they didn't have control of it. And they started to get worried, which is why they called these meetings. And I think it was in the July 10th meeting. No, it was in the August 4th meeting where they had bin Laden determined to attack the United States. That memo that Condoleezza Rice ignored. And when she testified in the 9/11 Commission, she was asked to read the title out. I mean, that was that sort of like press moment. It seems that what the CIA did was, and George Tenet as well, is that they basically worked in the summer of 2001 to cover their asses without letting the White House or the FBI know about these two people, these two future hijackers. Rather, they kind of let low-level people at the FBI know, and they raised a general alert to the White House to cover their ass to say, we're concerned that some really bad shit's going to happen, but they didn't give actionable intelligence that they had that could have prevented the attacks. And Richard Clark makes the point that even in the September 4th meeting, if they had said this, he believes that in 24 hours they could have found these guys. He goes, because they were staying at hotels with their own names. They were, and by the way, the morning of, all the hijackers bought their tickets for 9/11 on the exact same day. So there was a lot of data out there that they could use to apprehend these guys, and they didn't. And so I have to say that this was, again, a lot of interesting characters, a lot of interesting stories in this thing, and it made my stomach. I felt sick, and I remember at least 2 moments that I felt physically ill doing this research, because I lived on Lafayette. I lived on Lafayette Street between Franklin and White. And if you guys know New York City, any of you that were living in New York on 9/11 will know that was below Canal Street. That was below where they shut down the city. And every morning after 9/11, I was woken up from the blasts. And every morning afterwards, I would walk to school and I could smell the chemicals and God knows what else coming from downtown Manhattan. It was a very traumatic time for all of us that were living there. And also, I had a lot of friends who lost family members, who lost parents. The place where I went to high school, people, there were cars in the parking lot. You know, those stories, cars in the parking lot, because there was a commuter town, people going to the city, people not picking up their cars. So the idea that this could have been prevented, and not just prevented because now we, connect the dots later. No, like actually, is it's hard to explain the feeling of it. I mean, the word sad doesn't begin to capture it. And so like there's a larger reason that I should have probably said this in the beginning, but there's a larger reason that I'm doing this. Obviously, 9/11 is super important. Historically, it's important. But this thing of like we talked about it with Jeffrey Sachs, this thing of a deep state, and I'm very allergic to the kinds of conspiracies that tend to circulate, which I think are just like not credible about all sorts of stuff, not just this. And I just feel like it's people just not being disciplined thinkers, kind of just indulging in this is fun, let's just talk about it. Or let's just act like we think we know what's going on, or who knows what, or a coping mechanism for ignorance. This is a real theory that explains an event that should have led to investigations, at the very least, people being fired, if not indicted. Instead, what happened was the people who blew the whistle on this were fired or gone after. In some cases, I think jail time. We're talking about John Kiriakou, Mark Rossini at the FBI. I forget who else. There was one other person that was involved. I mean, like anytime someone tried to blow the whistle, their houses were raided. I mean, and this was 20 years ago. And of course now it's gotten much worse. So there's like that whole thread to talk about. Dude, there was also a lot of similarities in researching this between this and COVID-19. Like the relationship between CIA and Saudi intelligence bear a lot of similarities to NIH and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And both in terms of like how their cooperation or their sort of the things they were doing together leading to catastrophic outcomes, and then also like covering it up and not getting caught, and everyone just kind of moves on. And there's something really disturbing about the nature of this system, that it operates in this way, that it can lead to such maleficent outcomes or malevolent outcomes, and then there's no accountability. And that notion of accountability, or its lack thereof, is for me like a really critical part of why I'm doing this, because I feel like so many of the problems we have today stem from a lack of accountability, whether we're talking about 9/11 Iraq, because again, 9/11 happens, and what was the story? We missed this because we didn't have enough power. We weren't able to invade your privacy enough. We need to invade Iraq. And so these people that were responsible for this disaster were further empowered as a result of it, and then sent us down a series of catastrophic foreign policy disasters. And we now find ourselves here we are today, and we just continue to double down. And then you get someone like Trump saying we gotta drain the swamp because of all these people. And it makes sense, although again, the solutions that Trump puts forward are not solutions. It's just rhetoric. It's just vibes. So there's that. There's also, I also want to throw in here. So I mentioned, COVID. I'm also really fascinated by what's going on with the whole UAP stuff, UAP, UFO. I have the former head of ATIP coming on the podcast, Lou Elizondo, because I want to talk about, I mean, I'm less interested in talking about UFOs only because he doesn't share anything. Like, it's just, everything is apparently like, and I shouldn't do air quotes because that's the other problem. This is another part of this whole story, is that the secrecy of everything's become top secret. Everything's become, classified. There's actually an article that I had read years ago about like the classification crisis. So, I want to talk to Lou also about like, what does this tell us about like how government works? Like what government is, where power resides, who has power? That we can't get answers to these questions about UAPs. like it's super weird, right? You keep hearing about UAPs. It's like, so why don't we just get an answer already? I mean, supposedly Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader at the time, was pushing for these investigations. We've had a bunch of hearings with people in Congress. Why don't we have the answers already? What is this whole talk about? There are, pieces of craft or like alien materials being housed at defense contractors. Which defense contractors? Why don't we know this? Like it really breaks your schema of how government works. And so one of my other goals in doing these two episodes on 9/11 and this episode on UAP is to give my best for myself and then for all of you a better schematic for how the government actually works. Like what the hell is actually going on here? Because the official story obviously is bullshit about everything, everything of consequence. But the conspiracies that come out are like just a lot of these conspiracies are just like not serious conspiracies, but get tons of traction. So like there's an opportunity there in the middle to like actually address these things. And this 9/11, this experience of going down the 9/11 rabbit hole, because it's been 20 years plus since, because of my already all I know about this, I was actually able to get to a point where I was like, oh, this conspiracy theory makes sense. And so like I would like to be able to do something similar for an overall schema of what, how this works, like how you can get these types of conspiracies and you can also get these cover-ups. So that's what I've been working on. And so I have no episode that's going to come out on Monday because I was spending my time just focused on this. And I don't know how I'm going to roll out these two episodes, the two on 9/11. I might just roll them out together, kind of, a few days apart. And then I've got Luella Elizondo, not this week, the next week. So just wanted to give you guys a heads up on this. Let me know what you think. I have tons of links. This, like I said, this is a great book. I'll give you a few more. Hold on. This one here too. I actually just listened to it as an audio. This one. It's the Uncensored History of the 9/11 Investigation. And I mentioned Against All Enemies by Richard Clarke. What do we got here? I got Rise of the Vulcans. I have, Imperial Hubris too, Michael Scheuer's book. So Rise of the Vulcans, Against All Enemies. These are from, back in the day when I was a young man reading this in 2004. But I got a lot of links of other material in this PDF. So like, if you guys want to go down this rabbit hole, you can go down this a lot faster than I did. So, all right, peace out, everybody. Let me know what you think.